Hello, and welcome to the Myersbriggs University podcast. This is a show where every other Wednesday I talk about the Myers-Briggs personality types in a new way that's easy to understand so you can improve your relationships with the people around you, but also yourself by learning why exactly we are the way we are. I'm your host, Isaac, and today we're going to talk about a couple things. First one being the full stack of cognitive functions, the differences between each of the 4 function positions, and what your general relationship with each function position is. So let's get into it. I didn't exactly plan on this episode to come out on New Year's Day, but I can't say that I'm upset about it. So Happy New Year to anybody who is listening, and I hope you've hit the ground running on whatever New Year's resolution you've come up with for yourself. And thank you for starting off the new year strongly by tuning in to the Myers-Briggs University podcast. I'm happy to celebrate the new year with the pod's first ever patron who will be receiving their personalized shout out at the end of the episode. So if you're not sure if you want to be a patron yet, feel free to check it out at the end and decide if you want your own shout out. So we covered the 4-letter dichotomy created by Myers and Briggs. Then we talked about all 8 of the Jungian cognitive functions and what they mean. So if you've made it to this episode, that means you've officially finished the podcast launch bootcamp. Hooray! Now that you've got a good foundation of how all of the functions behave, we can go a little deeper into different combinations of functions, which is really where the 16 individual types start to shine. Based on the last 2 episodes, you should be able to figure out what your type is if you figured out what your most preferred judging and perceiving functions are. If you're still a little unsure about that, we will talk about it in greater detail in this episode to hopefully clear up any residual confusion. If you're coming at this episode from the perspective where you're pretty sure you know what your type is, but you haven't memorized the order of your functions, then I'll put a document on my Patreon that outlines the cognitive functions in order for all of the 16 types for you to reference while we discuss the function stack order in this episode. In fact, no matter where you are with the cognitive functions, it will probably just be a good idea to reference that sheet while you're listening to this episode. Because we're still kind of covering such general MBTI knowledge right now, I can't really in good conscience put a simple document like that behind a paywall, so I'll make sure that everyone can access it on my Patreon for free. You could just as well find that information almost anywhere on the internet, but instead of making you search for it, I figured I'd just make it convenient and accessible to everybody on my Patreon. But if you would like even more extra content and a shout out on the pod, I'll never turn down new patrons. So the link will be in the description, but you can find me at patreon.com/mbuniversity. We've touched on this in previous episodes, but to start, I want to give a more focused breakdown on what exactly a cognitive function stack is. The basic idea that we've already covered is that while every type has its preferences, for instance, I'm an INTP, so my function preferences are going to be thinking and intuition over feeling and sensing, every type is still capable of using all 4 of the function attitudes. So thinking and intuition are going to be my top 2 function attitudes, but I've also got a bottom 2 which are going to be the feeling and sensing, because I still have to know how to feel things and see things practically, even if I don't prefer to. Identifying the order in which all 4 of the function attitudes occur will give you your function stack. The names of the placement order of your functions tend to vary if you're studying the functions from another psychologist's interpretation of Jung's work, which we will cover in later episodes. But for now, I'm just going to keep it simple and use the names that I learned when I first started getting into MBTI. That seems to still be the most commonly used and accepted by all, including the Myers-Briggs Foundation. I'll explain what each of my functions are along the way to help illustrate the order better and give you some context for your own stack as well. I won't go through every single stack for every type because this episode would be way too long for that. So for now, just try to understand what I'm saying for your relationship to each function position and refer to the free cheat sheet on Patreon that I mentioned and apply it to your specific cognitive functions. That shouldn't be too difficult if you've already listened to the previous episodes where we talk about what each of the individual cognitive functions really mean. Okay, so your first cognitive function in your stack is called your dominant function. This one is large and in charge. It is what you should consider yourself an expert at, and in some ways can even be hard to describe to other people because you tend to use it so effortlessly that to you it just feels like living your life. It is by far your most conscious cognitive process. You use it often and with great nuance, you use it maturely, and you use it with finesse. To other people, you make it look easy because for you, it is easy. My dominant function is TI, so my strongest cognitive process is making logical decisions based on what I'm able to recognize as what makes sense to me, rather than focusing on external numbers and data. Remember, because TI has an introverted orientation, it's subjective logic. This means that I'm basically at all times looking to understand in my own words how things work and why they are the way they are in order to make my decisions. That's always my first priority, is understanding the logical mechanisms of a situation before making any decisions. I won't spend a lot of time on the dominant function because the way everyone experiences their dominant function should be pretty similar to the way all of the functions were described in the last 2 episodes. You're firing on all cylinders with your dom function, so even the most intricate nuances should come to you with relative ease. One last thing to point out that will be important when considering the remaining functions in the INTP stack is that the dominant thinking attitude is introverted. It makes sense that an introvert's strongest function would be an introverted one. The introverted-extroverted orientations for the following functions in the stack will be interesting and important to observe going forward, so I thought I'd point it out early. The second function in every type stack is called the auxiliary function. Carl Jung doesn't spend much time talking about the auxiliary function in his book, but the few points he does bring up are pretty interesting and informative. He describes the auxiliary function as relatively unconscious, by which he means it is still a function we consciously use, but is less conscious in comparison to our dominant function. So, okay, sure, that should make sense. It's in second place, therefore it is our second best in terms of how effectively we use it. We did touch on this next point in a previous episode, but I'll go over it with some more context here. Jung also described the auxiliary function as, quote, different in nature from the dominant function, but not antagonistic to it. So, as an INTP with my dominant function being TI, the auxiliary function cannot be a feeling function, because as a judging function, it would directly compete with TI by trying to make decisions with feeling instead. So only intuition and sensing attitudes are compatible with dominant TI, because those are the 2 perceiving functions. At this point, it sounds like a Dom TI user could potentially have 4 different perceiving functions in their auxiliary function placement, either of the sensing functions, SI and SE, or either of the intuition functions, NI or NE. This is a very important, I'll say, semi-controversy, because this particular topic marks one of Myers-Briggs' interpretations of Jung's work that can't necessarily be confirmed or denied, because, unfortunately, Jung actually wasn't specific or explicit enough in his explanations at this junction. Which, just a side note, Carl Jung was obviously a very smart man. Nobody can take that away from him, but his book, Psychological Types, it's not easy to read, okay? It is, in fact, not perfect, and there are some points that could have been further clarified that probably would have prevented some infighting about this next point. Okay, so the interpretation that Myers-Briggs had of Jung's description of the auxiliary function was this. If the dominant function for INTP is TI, and the auxiliary function has to be different from the dominant, i.e., it's a perceiving function instead of a judging function, then the auxiliary function should also be different in the introverted-extroverted orientation with respect to the dominant function. So if you're a TI dom like me, your auxiliary function has to be extroverted, either NE or SE. Myers and Briggs have been criticized for this because Jung doesn't explicitly say that the auxiliary function has to be opposite in the introverted-extroverted orientation, but the problem is that he doesn't say they should be the same orientation either. He just, doesn't comment on it. Personally speaking, I think that having an opposite orientation makes sense. If the auxiliary function can't be another judging function because it would compete with the dominant for decision making, I think it makes equal sense that the auxiliary function can't be the same introverted or extroverted orientation as the dominant function, because otherwise they would be competing for subjectivity or objectivity at the same time. The way I see it, Myers and Briggs did a well enough job that anyone could have done trying to extrapolate this ambiguous point in Jung's book. It really comes down to whether you want to have a more loose or a more strict interpretation of Jung's work. Dare I say, a perceiver versus judger interpretation. Unless Jung comes back from the dead to set the record straight, there isn't a confirmed correct answer, but the most common interpretation that I know of is Myers and Briggs' framework, which is that the introverted and extroverted orientations alternate as you go down the function stack. So as an INTP, if I'm a TI DOM and my auxiliary has to be extroverted, then I'm left with NE or SE. Obviously, it's got to be NE because I'm an INTP. I'm an intuitive type. One more important point about the auxiliary function that Jung makes is that it is subservient to the dominant function. The extent to which you use your auxiliary function depends solely on whether or not it is useful for your dominant function. This helps us differentiate between how the functions work in types that have almost the same function stack, but not quite. You can see this pattern in every set of two types that differ only in the introvert-extrovert dichotomy. So, for example, INTP dominant and auxiliary functions are TI and NE respectively, and ENTP's DOM and aux functions are NE and TI respectively. Same functions, just a different order. This is probably where that function cheat sheet would really come in handy. The most obvious difference, and one of the only ones at that, between INTP and ENTP is that one type is introverted and one is extroverted. That's the difference in the letters in their dichotomy. But how do the differences in the order of their cognitive functions set them apart? It must have some significance, because if it didn't, then what's the point of differentiating between the DOM and aux functions at all? In INTPs, the auxiliary NE will only be used to the extent to which it is useful to the dominant TI. This means that of all the millions of possibilities and ideas that the INTP can come up with, only the ones that will assist the INTP in their ultimate goal of understanding how and why something works will actually be used. Any idea that doesn't help the INTP understand how something works will be cast aside. In ENTPs, the auxiliary TI will only be used to the extent to which it is useful to the dominant NE. This means that of all the things they can choose to understand how and why they work, the ENTPs will only choose to focus on the things that help them generate new ideas that are different from what is already known. They don't want to waste their time understanding something if it doesn't offer the opportunity to expand on it and turn it into something new. The difference in the way INTP and ENTP frame their strong suits of learning how things work and considering new ideas is what sets them apart, other than the fact that one is an introvert and the other is an extrovert. Most people think of these two types as being introverted or extroverted based on how they gain energy with respect to socializing with other people, and that is a correct way to distinguish them. But you can also determine them to be introverted or extroverted by function preference too, which is a completely separate process from their social preferences. I could go further into the minute differences between the DOM and aux functions, but we already have so much more to get into with the bottom two functions, so I'll table it for now. But if this concept sounds interesting and you want to hear more about it in detail, let me know. Maybe I'll do an episode comparing all of the introverts and extroverts if there's enough want for an episode like that. So after the auxiliary, we have the tertiary function, We love the tertiary function. It's the third function in the stack, and if we're continuing with the alternating introverted and extroverted orientations, then this will be the same orientation as your dominant function. That means if you're an introvert by nature, so is your tertiary function. And you can also apply the same logic for extroverts. The waters get a little muddier the further down we go into the lower functions. So I'll start with Jung's interpretation because he was the one who started it all, and ironically tends to have the least to say about the tertiary and inferior functions compared to other people who have built on his work. In Psychological Types, at the end of chapter 10, where he discusses cognitive functions, Jung outlines a scenario where a person has a dominant thinking function followed by an auxiliary sensing function. He doesn't say whether they're introverted or extroverted or anything, which would have been a great time to clear up that whole does the introverted-extroverted function orientation alternate as you go down the function stack thing. But alas, we've got to work with what we've got. He says here that a grouping of unconscious functions exist in addition to the two conscious ones we just talked about. In this example, he describes that the dom thinker aux sensor would have, quote, an unconscious intuitive feeling that may correspond with the conscious practical intellect, that's the sensing function, whereby the function of feeling suffers a relatively stronger inhibition than the intuition. This is really interesting because what he's outlined for us is that a dominant thinker auxiliary sensor will actually have tertiary intuition followed by inferior feeling, which he describes by saying that feeling is inhibited even more than intuition. This is a bit of a dense and confusing way to word it, so I'd recommend listening back if that was confusing. Or you can read through the transcript of this episode on my Patreon if you're more of a visual learner. So this is especially interesting because the example function stack that Jung gave orders the functions as a dominant judging function, auxiliary perceiving function, then tertiary perceiving function, followed lastly by an inferior judging function. Jung does very little to explain exactly why he chose this order for these functions, but my personal interpretation is that he probably thought it unnecessary to pursue much because he deemed both the tertiary and inferior functions to be part of our unconscious minds and mostly inaccessible to us anyway, so what does the order really matter if the functions are inaccessible? He also mentions that it really only becomes necessary to know much about the unconscious functions if you're a psychologist that needs to treat patients. Jung actually warns against lay people developing these functions directly from the unconscious because, quote, this attempt must always come to grief since it involves a great violation of the conscious standpoint. He gives an example of how he has seen this play out when physicians try to develop their feeling function out of the unconscious, presumably for a better bedside manner, I would guess. But it somehow always backfires, and to be honest, he loses me a little bit in the middle of the analogy because it's like one long run-on sentence with a million commas, so maybe we'll come back to it another time when I can make more sense of it. We've got enough information to sift through as it is, not to mention that his example isn't necessarily infallible because he assumes that all physicians must be dominant thinkers and inferior feelers, which doesn't have to be the case, but, you know, nobody gets everything perfect the first time. Again, I cut him some slack here because he was one of the first people to even be talking about this kind of stuff. It's much easier to criticize his work when you have literally 100 years worth of additional research, data, and retrospect at your disposal, like me. Before we move on from Jung's perspective on the tertiary function, I want to end his section with a quote from the end of the chapter that goes, quote, the unconscious functions are in an archaic animal state. Their symbolic appearances in dreams and fantasies usually represent the battle or coming encounter of two animals or monsters, unquote. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on his final sentiment, but I want to point out that he spelled the fantasies with a PH, and that is simultaneously badass and absolutely hilarious to me. Like I said, the lower functions in this stack and our relationships with them is where the majority of disagreements tend to come up. Although sometimes even the auxiliary function gets dragged into debates, but we'll talk about that some other time. Jung described both of these functions as unconscious, whereas the Myers-Briggs Foundation, and other psychologists with alternative cognitive function models that we'll talk about in future episodes, describe the tertiary function as a conscious one that becomes more useful and effective later in life. The exact point in life that this happens also tends to vary from your early 20s all the way to middle age, which I can only presume that means between the ages of 40 and 50. For the purpose of the podcast, I'm going to interpret the tertiary function as being conscious, which is in alignment with the Myers-Briggs Foundation, not necessarily in accordance with Jung's description. My reason for this is that the Myers-Briggs Foundation is more current, has easier to interpret explanations, and is an expansion of Jung's original work. Not to mention that I think most people who study MBTI recreationally also consider the tertiary function to be a conscious one, so by popular vote, that's what we'll go with unless otherwise stated. Still though, I think it's important that we understand the origins of these cognitive functions that we talk about and how the theory has evolved over time, and also how some components of this theory can still be highly debated as nothing is purely set in stone. If we consider this function as a conscious one, then you should be able to make a concerted effort to improve your relationship with it and use it more effectively and maturely over time. I think the point in time at which you really start interacting with your tertiary function and applying it to your life depends on how willing you are to accept that it is a valuable skill to work on, despite not being a preferred mode of cognition. If you're open to acknowledging it early in life, then you might start making solid progress towards honing this function in your 20s. And if you're more avoidant of it, then it might take a little longer. Another good way to think about it is like this. Your tertiary function is a skill that doesn't come naturally to you right away, but you have the potential to see its value and become skillful at it if you make the conscious choice to work at it. If you choose to do nothing, then you'll likely use it ineffectively or immaturely by default. I've heard people describe their relationships with the tertiary function in a lot of different ways over the years, most of which I can't really verify from any kind of credible source like Jung's work, his students' work, or the Myers-Briggs Foundation, or any other psychology-based academic journal publications. But for the sake of fun, I'll rattle off a few that I can at least personally attest to having experienced at some point. This all very well could just be confirmation bias, since I'm essentially just seeing other people's interpretation and going, hey, I experienced that too. But isn't that just the bread and butter of all psychology in general? Are you actually seeing what you think you're seeing? And how can you confirm it beyond the shadow of a doubt? Most of the time, the answer is actually we could find out more if we were okay with escalating and doing psychological experiments that forego ethics, but we usually, thankfully, decide let's not throw ethics out the window and just make a note that it could be confirmation bias. So one of the most memorable ways that the tertiary function has been described to me is it's either there or it's not. Basically, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's like a really finicky machine, like, I don't know, a copy machine or something. Thinking about this in the context of my own tertiary function as an INTP, which is SI, I can think of scenarios where this has definitely been the case. SI is all about past information that you've organized so that you can call upon it to support your current decisions. I've had times in life where I had a daily planner with everything I needed to get done for the entire week on it, and I'm keeping track of my progress like a champ. But just as often, I've had periods of time where I do still get everything done because, remember, SI is not my preference, therefore I don't rely on it consistently to make me an effective person like I do with TI and NE. But my tangible record that proves I did everything I needed to is non-existent or so disorganized that it's pretty much useless. For example, let's say my partner says, "Hey Isaac, did you do the laundry?" while I'm out at the store. In this case, because I have no physical record of it, and usually by extension, no memory of doing it, I'll be like, I don't know actually. Only to find out when we get home that the laundry has finished its cycle in the dryer and is ready to be folded and put away. I'm still an effective and functioning person, but my SI being tertiary and sometimes working, sometimes not, gives me the unique experience of being sometimes very bad at keeping track of the practical information that is relevant to my life. Of course, sometimes it actually does turn out that I didn't do the laundry because I wasn't doing a good enough job of accurately and diligently keeping track of my tasks. I like to think the former scenario happens more often than not, but what do I know? Having this struggle is part of what makes me an INTP and not an ISTJ, for example. This will be the last point about the tertiary function before we move on. One other way I've heard it described is as your comfort function. Some people claim to use it in ways that are low stakes, low risk, and bring them comfort. I think this makes sense because if your ability to use this function is, at a baseline, a little simplistic, then it follows if you were to use it, you would want to use it in situations that you felt weren't a major threat if you did a less than stellar job at using the function effectively. I can personally attest to this, where I see my tertiary SI play out a lot with nostalgia for movies, shows, video games, anything that I know like the back of my hand. Of course, everyone experiences nostalgia at some point in their life to varying degrees, but I think it plays a larger role for me due to my tertiary SI. Another example would be having some kind of structure or detail-oriented hobby. This podcast would be a great example, actually, because every episode needs to have some structure and planning behind it to ensure that as much information is communicated precisely and accurately, as well as in a logical order to maintain the ebb and flow of the discussion. I also have to carefully edit it to cut out bad takes, add music, sync it with the intro, etc. Oh, the inferior function. If you thought the tertiary function was controversial because of differing viewpoints, you better buckle yourself in. I spent a lot of time talking about Jung's view on the tertiary function, and his view of the inferior function really isn't any different, other than, yes, he also considered the inferior function to be unconscious, but even more so than the tertiary function. Since he didn't have much else to say about it other than that, we'll talk a bit more about the other viewpoints. The Myers-Briggs Foundation has a rather interesting interpretation of the inferior function that, to put it simply, contradicts itself. I'll read the excerpt verbatim so you can see what I mean, but before I do, here's a bit of extra context. While describing each function placement, the Myers-Briggs Foundation uses an analogy of the 4 function positions serving a unique role in a moving car to explain their effectiveness, which I actually really like. The dominant function is the driver, obviously. The auxiliary function is the front passenger/navigator. The tertiary function is the teenager in the back seat that minds its own business but pipes up when it needs something. And the inferior function is the baby in a car seat, which is accurate, but at what cost? With that said, here's the excerpt. The 4th process, non-preferred and not shown in your 4-letter type, or inferior process, tends to be the least developed and conscious in individuals. Therefore, they tend to have difficulty accessing it, and when they do, they may feel incompetent and uncomfortable in its use. The inferior process is opposite in every way to the dominant process. If the dominant process gets most of our psychological energy and attention, then the inferior process gets the least. For example, if the dominant process is introverted feeling, then the inferior process would be extroverted thinking. In our analogy of the personality car, the inferior process is represented by the baby in the car seat in the back seat. If the baby is sleeping, the driver probably won't notice them there, much like the unconscious nature of the inferior process. Hey there, this is Future Isaac cutting into the episode to say that the Myers-Briggs Foundation's description here actually does not contradict itself, and 'twas actually I who had terrible reading comprehension because I'm just a little bit of a dumbass, so keep that in mind as you listen to the next part. I decided to leave it in just because I think it spawns some interesting thoughts and ideas, but just know that I did make a mistake here. Okay, back to the episode. The beginning paragraph identified it as a conscious function, but the very last sentence alludes to the function's unconscious nature. They refer to the function as a conscious one a few more times on the same page, so I can only assume that they do actually consider it a conscious function, and maybe just weren't excessively clear about this unconscious nature, as they call it. From what I understand about this function, and what I infer is probably how the Myers-Briggs Foundation is trying to describe it, is that this function sits on the precipice of the unconscious. So it is conscious, technically speaking, but just very easy to ignore because it's almost unconscious, or parts of it can come out in an unconscious way, even if you can consciously acknowledge your capacity to use this function deliberately. It's like if your unconscious mind is the ocean at the bottom of a cliff, then your inferior function is like a tree that has grown on the very edge of the cliff, and you can see some roots sticking out from the edge, and it's kind of like, I don't know, leaning off the cliff, but it's still there. You can see it and interact with it. It's just that it's almost falling into the ocean. So hopefully that makes sense. The quote already iterates this, but your inferior function is the exact opposite of your dominant. So the INTP inferior function is FE, extroverted feeling. So for me personally, I am the least comfortable with making decisions with respect to how it affects the feelings of others or the morale of a group. Instead, of course, relying on my dominant TI, I will choose to make decisions that make sense to me. A good example of these two processes being at odds would be, let's say, giving emotional advice to a friend. A high FE, low TI user would spend considerable energy on how they would choose to deliver their advice to make it more palatable to their friend. Some call it sugarcoating, and sometimes it is, but other times it's also just knowing how to deliver sensitive information without provoking conflict. They're two sides of the same coin. A high TI, low FE user would spend more energy on the most logical way to deliver advice, which can sometimes unintentionally come at the expense of tact, because being tactless, frankly, requires less work than being tactful. I recently saw a clip of amazingly hilarious, famous cartoon sensation SpongeBob SquarePants, where SpongeBob says to himself something to the effect of, "I feel so guilty about this thing that I did. It's all my fault. Maybe I should talk to Patrick and he can help ease my guilt." Hard cut to Patrick, who just says, "Well, it sounds like it's all your fault." Kind of a silly example, but it does show how low FE could manifest in someone who really doesn't give much thought to the delivery and only focuses on the logic of the situation. I haven't been quite that bad in my delivery, to my knowledge, but I also haven't been that much better, especially when I was a teenager. The sweet spot for an INTP who tries to develop their FE is going to be someone who, like all TI DOMs, still focuses on what the most logical conclusion is, which could still be, it's all your fault, but they can use their inferior FE to recognize that there might be a less blunt and inflammatory way to deliver that information. Something along the lines of, well, it sounds like you didn't make the best decisions that you could have in that situation, and that's really unfortunate for you and the other people involved. Let's think of ways you can try to fix the situation now, or if you can't fix anything at all, how you can improve in the future so it doesn't happen again. Saying all of that doesn't contradict the more blunt way of saying, yeah, it's your fault, but it poses additional thoughts like maybe you can learn to accept responsibility and understand that there is a lesson for you to learn, as well as an acceptance and forgiveness of yourself, even when something actually is all your fault. All of these additional points focus on restoring harmony and balance to the social structure that FE tends to value and TI tends to ignore. Your inferior function can very much be a blind spot in your cognition that you forget to consider because you're very uncomfortable with it, or in some cases, you even devalue it in comparison to your dominant function that reigns supreme in your mind as the absolute best way to think. That's not supposed to sound bad, that's just how all of us actually perceive our dominant functions. It's the best way for each of us to think and carry ourselves through the world. That's why we chose to develop it so much at a young age that it became our dominant function. And I know that blind spot is a buzzword associated with the shadow functions that we've yet to talk about. I don't mean to posit any relation between the two by using that word, it just happened to fit the best. If you don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. We'll talk about blind spots in a later episode. so your inferior function is easy to overlook, and that can result in some kind of embarrassing blunders on your part when it would have been a good idea to try using it, but you ignored it instead. A lot of times when you're first getting acquainted with your inferior function, it will feel awkward, uncomfortable, or even stressful trying to use it because it's your greatest weakness, your biggest source of insecurity, and even the easiest function to act out in unhealthy and toxic ways. I mean, hell, no wonder people avoid it. Did you hear that description? But it also holds the potential for very rewarding character development if you stick with it, because it will turn you into the most well-rounded version of yourself. At least that's what the Myers-Briggs Foundation and more contemporary information suggests. Jung actively discouraged it because he thought the function belonged to the unconscious, and trying to switch your conscious and unconscious mind would essentially completely change you as a person in confusing, unnatural, and improbable ways. It's up to you to decide how you choose to think of the lower functions in your stack, but I'm more aligned with the contemporary outlook when it comes to this topic, not really so much Jung's ideas. Before we wrap up the episode, I want to make a point to say that no matter how hard you try or how often you work at developing your inferior function, it will always be your weakest function, and that's okay. We all chose our dominant function in early childhood while we were doing some serious cognitive development, and we chose our dominant function for a reason. Something about our lives indicated to us that our dominant function was the best fit for us, and there is no reason to ever want or need to undo that in favor of the inferior function, or any other function position for that matter. Just because your inferior function is always your weakest in comparison to the others doesn't mean that it is a weak function. It can just mean that all of your functions are strong, and the other three are stronger. There's a difference. This episode turned out to have so much more information than I expected, like all of the episodes that I write. I originally planned on going through all of the functions and how they might manifest in the inferior position, but I think that's best saved for another episode. What I'd like you to do is to think about how each of these different cognitive function positions relate to your personal stack for your type, and what your relationship with your functions is like. Use the knowledge of the cognitive functions you gained from the previous episodes to guide you. Especially meditate on those lower functions because our relationships with them tend to be a lot more complicated and therefore have the most untapped potential for growth and learning how to be a better version of ourselves. Reach out to me on socials or through my email or Google voicemail and let me know what you discover. I'd love to talk about it. But before we close out the episode for real, we have got to give some props and recognition to the podcast's first ever patron on the $5 undergraduate tier. So thank you to my mom, Leanne, for doing the most ISTJ thing she possibly could by being the first in line to support the pod and putting that auxiliary TE to good use by giving me more resources to keep doing what I'm doing. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for tuning in to the Myers-Briggs University podcast today. If you want more personality content before the next episode, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/mbuniversity for only $5 a month. You can participate in a private group chat about all things personality with myself and other members. You'll gain access to written transcripts of all my episodes, and I'll give you a fun, personalized shout out here on the podcast. If you're not interested in monetary support, that's totally fine. You can always just leave a review for the podcast, hopefully 5 stars, to help all of the algorithms get the podcast to new people who could benefit from tuning into the episode you just listened to. You can also interact with me on socials, mainly Instagram and Tumblr, where I'll post funny memes and a wealth of additional MBTI information too. All the links to those are in the description. If you have content suggestions or MBTI-related questions that you would like for me to address on the podcast, then feel free to contact me. You can text or call my Google voicemail. It goes straight to voicemail. I won't pick up. At 216-264-3997. Or you can email me at myersbriggsuniversity@gmail.com, all lowercase. I'll either play your voicemail audio or I'll read your email or text message aloud here on the podcast, but either way, I will answer your questions if you want. And as always, make sure to leave your name and your personality type if you want them to be included. Thank you so much again for tuning in to the Myers-Briggs University podcast, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. I've been your host, Isaac, and have a great day. Until next time.